Everyone ready? All right, great. Thank you for calling me up here, Mr. Speaker. Very proud to be here. Great to be in the world. Congratulations to everyone. Mr. Speaker, we think there's a problem in modern society. We think that when we see people living in the West especially, but really throughout the world, we see people being alienated from who they are. We see angst being the definitional understanding of who we are as people and what we understand ourselves as, and fundamentally the experience that most defines us. We don't know who we are lost, we are wandering, and we believe this is because we have lost our ties to our family. We have lost our ties to anything that we can say is our own. We have lost our ties to our community, and we are no longer grounded within any specificity. We are individuals and we are alone in the world. And for that reason, this House regrets the decline of tightly integrated families. We think this resolution is relatively self-explanatory. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by tightly integrated families first. So what we mean by tightly integrated families is two things. The first is, we think when you talk about a tightly integrated family, you have to think about it as the way that the people within that family understand themselves. So when you talk about a tightly integrated family, you want to talk about people who think of themselves as part of a family unit and not simply as individuals. But secondly, we think this relates to the way that people actually act. We think a tightly integrated family tends to live together, tends to engage in similar activities, have similar pursuits, understand themselves as belonging to similar communities, tend not to move far away from each other. We don't think any of these things are absolutely tight conditions, but we think this generally understands what we're talking about. These are the families that tend to be tightly integrated, tends to be the ones that understand themselves as being families first and individuals second. So that being said, let's move into our main points. So the first reason that we think that tightly integrated families are important and why we regret the loss of them is that we believe we've lost the ability to ground yourself in anything substantive or anything meaningful. So there's a couple of things we want to say under here. The first, we think that it's really important to understand as human beings that we don't exist simply as individuals or as islands. We think that as individuals and as human beings, we do exist communally, we exist relationally. I can't understand myself other than saying how I am in relation to other people. I'm not simply a person, I'm somebody's son, I'm somebody's friend, or et cetera, et cetera. I think all of those things are really important. We think that when you have the inability to do that, what you have a trouble figuring out is your identity or your sense of purpose. And we think this is something that we see a lot in modern society. I think if you can look at the example that we see of an extended adolescence that we talk about in the West. Well, I'm running around, I'm 25 and I'm 30. I never had a steady job and I'm picking up my third grad school degree. I don't know what I'm doing. I think that's a major problem. Yeah, sure.
Why is it better for you to ground yourself in a family that's determined by biological reasons rather than grounding yourself in something that is relatively important for your individual?
Yeah, sure. There's a variety of reasons. I think one, because it becomes very hard to ground yourself with other people when that is entirely based on choice. Because then you have constantly in a situation where you have to prove your value to another person and say that you only can exist in relationship to them as long as you can provide a value to them and that their friendship is something that they're getting something from you. We think at the point where you economize relationships, that's a problem, and that's going to be one of the points that my partner goes into a lot in her speech. But the second thing we think is incredibly important under the question of grounding of the self is the idea that when you have living with other people, when you live with your family and you spend a lot of time with your family, you tend to actually live in community with your family. We think this is something else really important that gets lost. We think it's really important to be able to be in a situation where you live in the same house as other people, because this teaches you a lot of really important things. The first thing this teaches you when you live in the same house as another person is just the basic conversations of sharing and working things out and being able to have a situation where your values and your needs are sometimes subjugated to other people's needs, and you're able to make the decision that sometimes what matters to me is most important, what matters to other people is most important. We think this is something you uniquely gain in a family, because when you're friends with somebody and that friend starts doing something that you don't necessarily like, you can very easily end that friendship. That is something that you're no longer required to work out. We think there are times when families bonds may need to be broken, but we think that they ought to be held more tightly, because simply when your father is mean to you or your mother says something you don't like, that shouldn't be the reason for you to end that relationship. We think there's an important societal skill being gained to working these things out that's entirely lost by not doing that. The impact of this is not simply that you're a sadder person, but also that societies and communities work less well together, because at the end of the day, we do have to live with people we don't like. We have to live with people who have different opinions from us. We have to live with people who have conflicting interests from us, and we have to live with people who want things that we also want, and we somehow have to mediate who gets what in society. At the point where you can't do that even in your own home, at the point where you run into conflict and the situation breaks down and you run away from the source of those conflicts, you can't expect meaningfully communities to make this decision decision for themselves together. We can't see communities doing these same things. The second thing that we want to talk about, though, is this question of the grounding in a community. There's a couple of reasons why we think families uniquely ground you within not just a community of your family, but the community that you live in together. The first reason we think this is really important, though, is because you have to, when you understand yourself in a family, you have to understand yourself as a part of a collective and a part of a whole. We think this is incredibly important when you're talking about a society, because when you're in a society, you have to be friends with other people. You have to be willing to give up some things so that other people can have more. You want to be able to have the ability to transfer wealth from people who have a lot of it to people who don't have a lot of it. The only way you can do that is by convincing people who have a lot of wealth that other people matter. When you say at the core bound of human relationships, so far as we have constructed them this far into human history, has been the family. At the point where you say you can get rid of that, all other bonds become weaker too. Because at the point where you say that all bonds are dependent upon the individual consenting into them out solely, then anytime a bond becomes inconvenient for me, I have no reason to follow it. At the point where the government says, hey, we should take some of your money and build some roads so people can drive places, you're going to just say no because that's inconvenient to me. We think that's a huge problem within communities. We think that families actually give you an ability to understand why that happens and for people to be more willing to do that. But secondly, though, we think families are friends with other families. And this is really important too, because it ties you into a neighborhood. It ties you into a locality. It ties you into a community. We think it's really hard for you to say to people like, look, you really should care about people you've never met or people that sort of you imagine as a mass. We think it's very easy for you to say, look, my aunt is friends with this person and this person needs help and they need food today. That's a way that you can actually get people to do meaningful good in their community. We think this doesn't happen when you conceptualize people as a large other, but rather when you build ties and bonds with people in your locality and in your community. We think that families uniquely allow you to do that. The next thing we want to talk about, though, is that it allows you to understand other people more uniquely as well. Because we think that we talked a lot about the way that you get alienated as an individual, you become untied and angsty as a person. But we think you also have the ability to understand other people more thoroughly and more fluidly when you have a familial relationship that's strong. Because we think there's two reasons for this. First, families are intergenerational. We think this is really, really important because we think especially a lot of the West, especially young kids tend to only think about other young kids as important. And the idea that your parents might have listened to good music and gone to concerts is entirely foreign to us. We think at the point where you're forced to live with the family and see the entire concept of people getting older and all of these things, you're able to empathize better with people across generations. We think this leads to a better society because you're able to understand and empathize with older people and see that I'm going to actually end up growing up this way, and there ought to be things that are done to support these people, but also you just understand them better as people. We think you're able to understand people better as people when you live in a family. The last thing that my partner's going to end up talking about in her speech is why this actually facilitates and creates diversity, which I think is going to be a large op that she's going to address in her speech. All these reasons, super proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister. I'll call on recognize the leader of opposition here.
Ready? Mr. Speaker, we think tightly integrated families are manifestations of a toxic and regressive patriarchal structure that have harms for the individuals involved, and the familial structure we don't think is relevant in the year 2014 and 2015, right? So the notion of it being a manifestation of a patriarchal structure and what its harms are is going to be my first argument. And secondly, I'm going to talk about how in the absence of familial structures, what exactly an individual's community ends up being, or what sort of collective identity do they sort of subscribe to, right? So first, let's talk about the notion of why it's a patriarchal structure, right? The concept of a family had come about as a sort of collectivization of interests and risks of individuals, and for the purpose of dividing labor, right? So that families that were living in the jungle tens of thousands of years ago could survive and they could procreate, right? And it was quite pertinent to note that when you had to compete against other animals, your biological aptitude sort of determined what the roles would be, right? So we think gender roles got entrenched because of biology thousands and millions of years ago, right? But obviously things have changed since then, right? Technology has largely made your hard-coded biological aptitude irrelevant, right? So we don't think it's necessary for men to be protectors and for women to be producing children, right? Things have definitely changed since then, and we think development of different economic and technological development of different economic and technological activities have changed that for people. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is that the family values in today's world tend to hold that back, right? In America, we see like the anti-choice people or the pro-life people opposing abortion, like, and women's rights in general, or opposing homosexual rights in general because of family values, right? We think the manner in which the moral relevance of a family has been taught to people when they've been growing up has been in such a way that it sort of circumvents the reason and rationality, and it just stays as a structure that exists because it has existed for so many millions of years, right? That is what a tradition is called, Mr. Speaker. And it is these traditional values that lead to several harms, even in today's world, right? Even in today's world, where we ought not to essentialize women to their uteruses, it still happens, for example, among conservative Christians, but largely in like developing countries like where we come from, right? So what are the harms? The first harm, Mr. Speaker, is that individuals are essentialized to their familial identity, right? Like, I was forced to become an engineer because my parents wanted me to do that, and the tightly integrated familial structure provided them large amounts of control over my life. I'm not happy with that. But secondly, right, we think, as the Prime Minister pointed out, families happen to have relationships with other families and find certain familial interests paramount, right? If you, as part of a tightly integrated family, are supposed to view your family's interests as superior to your own, you can't, for example, choose your marital partner, right? We see this as a serious problem where we come from in India, where like, you're not allowed to marry intercaste, you're not allowed to marry interreligion. There are honor killings as a result of this, and like we just think that's utter nonsense for you to say that like the goals of the family are like important, right? But secondly, surprise, surprise, tightly integrated families are really, really bad for women, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, the biological aptitude that existed originally, right, like thousands of years ago, has caused women to be trapped in gender roles, right? We still, like, grandfathers like still tell people that it makes sense for women to stay at home and take care of the kids, because who's going to take care of the kids otherwise, right? No. Right? Women are often not allowed to be educated. It's very, very hard, for example, like to move to a different city to take up a job if you want to do that. Women are often pressurized to have children by their in-laws, right, in tightly integrated families, even when they don't want to. We don't think that's okay. And very often, because we exist in patriarchal societies where like community leaders and familial leaders are often the men of the community and the men of the family, the interests of women are sacrificed at the altar of some larger, vague collective interest, which often is the family, but can sometimes be the caste or the community, right? So we just don't accept this. Closing.
You prove that patriarchy perpetuates inequality of women. Why can't men collectively outside of families enforce these same patriarchal values on women through the state and through those societies?
Right. The reason that can't happen is that when you are living outside a family and when you are an individual, you can then take autonomous decisions for yourself, right? That's kind of obvious. If I were living away from my family, I were paying my own way. I got to choose my own marital partner. I got to choose my own career, my own profession. That would be really, really great, right? If I wasn't, like, the comparative isn't can men oppress women under this system or that. The comparative is, right, under which scenario does an individual have to place the family's interests above their own, right? That's the comparative. Moving on, right? Third harm under my list of harms, Mr. Speaker, is really, really bad for homosexuals and people outside the gender binary, because no conception exists for gay people and like people outside the gender binary within a traditional family structure. I have already explained why the traditional family structure, by virtue of tightly integrated families, tries to perpetuate itself, right, through religion and through other means. But that brings me conveniently, no more. That brings me conveniently to my next issue, right, about how religion, traditions, and regressive factors manage to perpetuate themselves as a cause and an effect of the large family structure, right? So, for example, like the Prime Minister said, like, family values are important, and what your family holds important and holds dear ought to be important to you, whether you like it or not. But better take the same religion as your parents. You better do what they tell you to do. We're not okay with this, and we're not okay with this perpetuation. But lastly, on your the second argument I want to make, right, on how how in the absence of a familial structure, that doesn't mean you are absent of a collective identity. It just means you can choose it, right? So when my family disintegrates, the community that I have are my friends, my colleagues, people I choose to keep in my life, and that's much better for individuals because that makes them happier, right? Like just because you don't like choose your family doesn't mean they're like better for you. But secondly, it makes individuals more empathetic, right? Like you're more empathetic towards human beings when you see yourself as an individual and you see everyone else as an individual, and you don't like have to put the interests of your family before the interests of like some other individual who might be suffering, right? And on this intergenerational notion, we have people of different generations in our lives, even though we're individuals. Unfortunately, many of them still keep coming to worlds I'm proud to oppose.
Which, what?
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to do a couple of different things in my speech. I'm going to start out by extending my partner's first point and explaining how the arbitrary nature of non-biological families can be really detrimental to people who aren't born in this community and who don't have a strong family ties, and how that can be really problematic on a large societal scale and on an individual scale. And I'm also going to bring you a point of extension about societal progress and diversity, and how having tightly integrated families can actually lead to a lot more societal progress and better diversity on our side. I'm going to do some rebuttal then, and then I'm going to extend other points in a different way. But let's start first with this arbitrary nature of non-biological families. Because I think a big assertion that we've heard out of side opposition, both in the POIS by closing and in a lot of openings material, was that you can just choose your new family and it'll be really easy. But understand, Mr. Speaker, it can be very arbitrary who you end up forming these bonds with based on where you live, and it can also be really difficult to do so. We think it's important to note that you choose to be friends with individuals based on some sort of benefit you perceive they can bring to you. Like, I'm friends with Robbie because he's my debate partner and I have to debate with him every weekend, so it's probably good that we're friends and he brings a benefit to me. You befriend people because of the benefits you get out of them, not because of an inherent sense of value. What families can uniquely bring you is a sense of identity and a sense of loving and a sense of self-belonging, regardless of what benefit you bring to the families or what like commercialized benefits you can have. You belong to a family and the family loves you because of who you are, not because of what they can benefit you. The negative impacts of this on a non-biological family level is that it leads to you forming relationships with people based off what you can give to them and what you can provide to them. Let's say you can't provide things to other people and no one befriends you, and then you don't end up with a family. That's really negative, and that's a huge harm that ought not be perpetuated on individuals regardless. We think that individuals, even if they don't have commercialized value to other people, are still inherently valuable. And we think that the familial institution is the best possible way to recognize the inherent value of people and their inherent self-worth. We think that's important. But the next about the arbitrary nature of non-biological families, right? Like, it's actually really arbitrary who I'm friends with or who I form connections with. It's like based on who I live. Like, I lived in a substance-free residence hall my freshman year. Therefore, a lot of my friends abide by those same policies. If I had made different friends in college, we think that could have led to a totally different set of friends and a totally different family being formed. The important part about this arbitrary nature is that you might not share characteristics with the people around you, and therefore it's really hard to form connections with those people. We think when you have inherent built-in connections with your family, you're a lot more likely to have more meaningful relationships. First of all, meaningful relations, and secondly, more meaningful relationships. We think it's a really important benefit for the individuals and for society as a whole. But secondly, my point of extension about societal progress and diversity, because we actually think you get a lot better societal progress on our side of the house. Like, side opposition seems to have this very strange conception that tightly integrated families can't include families with gay parents or lesbian parents. That's ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. We think that there's going to be a lot more like a societal understanding and societal acceptance of tightly integrated families when they're not just conservative Christian families, when they include all sorts of families. We think that's a ridiculous assertion that we should just get out of the way right here. But secondly, we think that the familial unit, like I said, is the one place where you can be accepted for who you are. We think it can be really difficult for an individual when they are different from society, or when they differ in some meaningful way from the societal norms that are perpetuated by the society, to have acceptance outside out of their familial unit. They have to justify their existence. They have to justify their choices. What we see uniquely in families is that you don't have to justify all of your decisions in order to be loved or in order to gain some sort of acceptance. We think that's important. We think this is going to lead to more societal change and more societal discourse around some of these issues, therefore, because we think that when you have all this, when you have this in the family unit, you're going to have more discourse. You're a lot more likely to have societal change as a whole when these things occur within families, when an individual doesn't have to continually self-justify their existence. Back half.
If you live in a conservative community and you are a transgender person, you are much more likely to find acceptance in communities of other transgender persons rather than your family, who very likely hold those conservative values. The community is
So two responses to this. First of all, we think the existence of some bad families doesn't necessarily mean that all families are necessarily bad, or it doesn't mean you have to throw out the institution as a whole. We think that's a pretty obvious response in general. But secondly, we think conservative communities are going to exist regardless on the status quo. The question is not whether conservative communities will exist. The question is whether individuals will get better acceptance trying to individually seek out their self-worth in this conservative community, or whether they'll have better self-worth within their families, getting acceptance there, and therefore changing the conservative community. We think that's the comparative in the debate. We think that's really important for the rest of the round. Anyway, moving on to some of their ops. So their first op is basically a list of harms that the patriarchy perpetuates. And like, we agree, the patriarchy has a lot of harms, but we don't think that this necessarily changes on your side of the house. We think relationships on either side of the house are going to be negatively impacted by the patriarchy. We don't think we're getting rid of it. We actually think the patriarchy is going to be a lot worse on their side of the house when you have to seek out and self-justify your individual worth on an individual level. Like, women like give birth to children and have to take off some time for work. We think in a system where families already identify that as something good and something worthy, that you don't have to justify that decision to your employer as much, because your employer is also going to be a member of the tightly integrated community. But secondly, though, they talk about the family values in the United States. We think a lot of the reason for the family values is because the only tightly integrated families left in the United States are conservative Christian families. We think if all families were tightly integrated, they wouldn't feel as strongly that like gay people are threatening are threatening family values or something. We think when there are conservative Christians, they're going to exist in either situation. The question is, who changes conservative Christians' minds the most about these family values? And we think we fundamentally do that on their side of the house. I've already addressed their issue about the homosexuality and gender binary. We actually think when there are tightly integrated families that include gay parents and that include lesbian parents, it's going to lead a lot more positive discourse. Refer to my extension for that. We think that's really important. The second thing they talk about, though, is how you're not absence of a collective identity. And instead, you have this element of choice and who you want to identify with. I've already talked about a lot with my arbitrary nature of who you end up around and how it can actually be really difficult to form connections with people who you are just like happen to be near or happen to be like geographically located to. We think it's a lot more likely to form meaningful connections with people who you have a blood relationship with, who have to love you for who you are. We think that's important. But the second thing I want to talk about in response to this is the idea of rejection, because we think rejection is really harmful. Like, no one likes to be rejected. It's really hard to form relationships that are as close as family relationships with people you don't really know, because you're always afraid of that sense of rejection. We think you're going to have less meaningful relationships. Let's move on to my extension of my partner's points, though, because I think these are also really important to the round. So the second thing you talked about, though, was this idea of communal nature, right? And how communities are really important. We think it's important. What I'm going to extend on is when you have people making decisions based on their individual basis or based on this like arbitrary group nature that still forms off of benefits to the individual, you're going to have a lot of harms to the community, because the individual is not focused on a larger picture or is not focused on their family. They're instead focused on what will benefit themselves the most and what will have themselves succeed most in society, what will make them the most money. I think that leads to a lot of harms in the community. We think that leads to people not focusing on what's best for the most amount of people, that focuses on people only benefiting themselves. When you look at this behind a veil of ignorance, right? Like, you could be anyone in society. You're not necessarily like dedicated to being yourself. You have to look at what benefits the most people in society, and people are really bad at doing that. They look at what benefits the individual. We think you ought to prioritize the community, and we see that best done in family settings. We think that's really important. We also think the intergenerational aspect, the fact that you will be living with people from all over, is also more likely to increase your perception of harms done in society and make you more likely to oppose them. Really proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for call and recognize the Deputy Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Mr. Speaker, before I go on to further analyze what Bucky has told you in terms of why familial structures create rigid roles that are actually harmful for the people in these families, why they create a kind of homogeneity which is harmful for the people in these families, let's just go and recharacterize tightly integrated families, right? Because they'd like you to believe that all tightly integrated families live happily ever after. You know what? You don't even have to try to make them love you. They love you independent of who you are. You don't even have to justify your decisions. But we don't agree with this characterization, right? Because if that was true, no one would ever despise his mother. No one would ever despise their father, right? That's simply not true. Even tightly integrated families require work, require a level of effort to create those relationships. Just because you are of the same blood and flesh, those relationships are not automatically created, right? And we tell you, if people are able to do the work that is required in tightly integrated families to make those relationships work, people are equally likely to do that work with respect to other kinds of relationships. And we tell you those other kinds of relationships are more likely to be valuable, right? Why? Because they'd like you to believe that people just wander geographically and arbitrarily pick another person, and because that picking of that person is arbitrary, unlike your blood and flesh, that relationship is going to fail and you are going to be backstabbed by the other relationships you have, and the other relationships are not going to be more valuable. Why is this not true, right? Because when you go to college, when you stay in a community, you end up interacting with people who are the most like you. You end up interacting with people who have common interests. You are debating with your partner because you guys gel on a certain level. And if you take that same amount of effort that you would apply within your familial structure and apply it within yours, like if you spend as much as time with him and you would give him a Christmas gift, I'm sure he'd be like a great a family type member for you, right? We don't think familial structures are defined by blood and flesh. We think familial structures are ones that are defined by effort and commitment and real work. And we tell you from our side of the house, it's pervasive to force people to stay in those family structures which they were born into. It's much better if we let them choose their own families. It's fine if that's your original family, but we see no reason to decline tightly integrated families in the system that we now see today at Take Closing.
Is it more likely that the trans community will get reform on social policy if transgender people seed all relationships with people who aren't also trans?
No, wait 1 second. That's not the debate. The debate is not about everyone not having anything to do with their families. The debate is about, do we regret the decline of tightly integrated families? And with response to that question, we say no need to regret it, because I'm telling you, the reason some of these tightly integrated families have declined is people have found alternative avenues to be with people they prefer, to be with people they like more, and we think there's no reason to pass a value judgment on those kind of relationships. We think those kind of relationships are equally meaningful, and that's why we don't want to regret it. But let's just talk about Bucky's speech, which, if you think about it, has gone largely unrebutted, right? 2 points he brought to you. Firstly, about rigid gender roles, and secondly, about homogeneity within these families and why it's particularly pervasive, right? On the first idea, and look, you might like to believe that tightly integrated families can exist with a lot of different diversity and a lot of stuff, right? But that's simply not true. We're regretting the decline of tightly integrated families that have existed, and not the conceptual tightly integrated family in your head, right? So the family we are regretting, if you go back and look historically, there has always been division of roles, there have always been gendered roles, and there's a very good reason, there's an economic reason for this, right? It's called division of labor. The women bear the child, the men on the money in the house. It's important to realize that these families were initially tightly integrated because of the kind of mutual exchange they provided in the family, right? So when you tell me, when we look for value in other people and that's unreasonable, we say, hey, that's not unreasonable. It's okay to look for value in other people, to want to build relationships with people who give you some kind of value, right? But even families look for that value. So for example, in a family, the woman who is bearing a child is looking for value within her husband for him to provide money for the family. The man is looking for value within his wife to provide a child and sit at home and take care of the children, right? There is a mutual exchange of values. And that's important. Why? Because we think this mutual exchange of values has always been particularly pervasive for women. They've always been expected to take the backseat in the house. We're not saying that this is true of all tightly integrated families. We're saying it's true of the vast majority of tightly integrated families that have declined because women have opted out of this familial structure and have said, we're not going to be the woman sitting at home and taking care of the baby. I want to work. I'm okay with staying in a separated, different kind of living relation, whatever, right? So, no, sit down. That's on rigid rules and why those rigid roles are highly gendered. But on the second more important idea of homogeneity, right? It's important to realize, and that they themselves said, it's important to realize that within the kind of families that they perpetuate, the kind of tightness and the integration within these families exists because people largely agree with each other, right? You have to agree with your elders to a very large extent. You have to there is a familial tradition, there's a familial value. The minute you go away or you disconnect from that familial value, this family is no longer tightly integrated, which means we think a lot of social change that we have seen in the last couple of decades is because people have gone against traditional family values. 50 years back, traditional family values said women can only do this, men can't love other men, women can't love other women. We think this kind of social cohesion and social change that has happened is because it's often necessary to oppose traditional values that have happened in your family. And the risk of, we think this is particularly important with respect to the older generation, right? And we think a lot of families have gone ahead and disintegrated and are not tightly integrated families anymore because the younger generation has told the older generation that we don't accept your values of religion, we don't accept your values of marriage, and we want to change, right? We think it's important to not regret the decline of these tight-knitted families, right? The comparative here, Mr. Speaker, is not everything is hunky-dory in their family land. Families have disintegrated for a good reason. We're extremely proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for those remarks, and now call upon to recognize the Member of Government.
Mr. Speaker, our oppositions today have kind of asserted that racism, sexism, homophobia are somewhat a product of the family. On this side, we're going to give you a more realistic depiction that these are social factors that exist also outside the family. And the comparative in this debate is that individual more able to make free choices, to prosper as a potential human being if they are denied the support of a family base and thrown into a ruthless and cutthroat individualistic market? We say that that's not the case, and that the family is a necessary bulwark and buffer against rampant individualism that this side represents. We're going to present this in three ways today. Firstly, looking at what is the kind of alternative that really exists and rubbishing the apparent alternative collectivization that they want to stand for. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why the family unit is probably the most brilliant unit at challenging these kind of social factors because they allow you to appeal to common things that you have in common, whether that be the fundamental unit that is biologically and socially constructed, being the family. Thirdly, I'm going to look at why particularly the family is a necessary supporting unit that can never be replicated. Okay, firstly, what is the alternative that they want to rely on in this debate? And more importantly, what is the nature inherent to a family? Number of characteristics that we'd like to bring you. Firstly, it's intense and unconditional love that whether it is biologically or socially constructed, we really don't care. The fact that it has existed and accepted on such a great level, something that is not replicated. Importantly, the biological element of it, the fact that you have a child and that is biologically yours, is an aspect that contributes to the notion of unconditional love and doing things that unconditionally for the individual that you have had. Secondly, it's often entirely selfless service for that child. Thirdly, because it is constructed and normalized in a way that centers around that biological nature, it is unrivaled by any rival interest group or collectivization that they want to support. Why can't the other like groups that these guys have been hinting at closing support this? Because they necessarily don't possess these particular characteristics, namely the biological link to the child, or like in instances where there is not a biological link, the fact that you are replicating something that is biological and accepted in a way that is socially normalized to such an extent over history. This is a powerful unit that cannot be rivaled like in its strength and the willing to get people to commit to it and to do things for their child. Because the relationship can't really be effectively supplanted or copied by other groups, you necessarily, when you pull away from family or tight-knit families, you deny individuals a buffer. Because like you throw them into a world where they're able to apparently make choices, where they're apparently to find like-minded individuals. But really what this means is that you deny them support from a young age. You say that you are an individual who's not fully formed, but go out into the world and find the people who are most like you. In those instances, what you have done is denied them particularly the particular aspects of this unit which are inherent to the family and said that you must go seek them out somewhere. We deny that those kind of units can be created or exist. So in that instance, I'm now going to prove to you why family is a particularly useful unit to protect individuals from the forces of market individualism. They wanted to say, and this is kind of how this fits into what has come out at opening, that this denies people choice, that, you know, the family supplants choice and denies them the ability to be individuals. That ignored the comparative, and they explicitly denied this at certain points. That the comparative is a world where there is no family to fight against social forces like racism and homophobia, like where you don't have a family to support you. How does the family do this? Firstly, it defends the individual against poisonous things like economic liberalism or the kind of individualist notions that they want to represent. The family, by collectivizing its assets, by supporting you in your education, whether or not it's not like, sorry, the engineering degree that you don't want to do, allows you and protects you in a way that you would not get access to particular social resources. Because this is a unit which is based off unconditional love, of mimicking and creating social meaning from a biological transaction between two people, it necessarily commits people in a way to give money, to give support in a way that no other collective union, whether you seek out other gay people after you've apparently turned 16, they will never be incentivized you to support in that particular way. It means that the incentive, the need to support, to help, to allow you to kind of prosper and incubate for the periods where you are vulnerable, when you need an education, when you need to get access to social resources that the market isn't necessarily going to provide you. There's a unit that always has an incentive to do that, even though it's not particularly rational for them to do that, right? It's probably more rational for them to force you to go out and work and to contribute to themselves. Because the family is able to co-opt and harness particular characteristics, it's able to provide a bulwark and a protection for those individuals. Secondly, it minimizes I'll take closing.
Not only is our side perfectly comfortable saying that families can exist to protect basic rights, but moreover, to the degree that there are unique benefits to being in a family, each of those benefits is definitionally—
Okay, you're just missing it, right? Families will do it less if we move away from these units. We say they are valuable. Cool. Secondly, they minimize intergenerational equity. They collectivize assets, and although this is not always totally inadequate, they're able to pass on wealth and collectivize it in a way at individual levels that does not exist in other collective units. Thirdly, they protect and instill cultural diversity. This is a side that wants to say that it's always bad that particular values and norms are being passed on or even enforced on particular children. But there is value in cultural practice and identity in fighting against majoritarian norms that families are best at instilling and passing on to those individuals. Now I'm going to move to the second part of my speech. Why is family the best construct to change things? In two ways. Firstly, it allows you to co-opt and use a particular unit or a particular social construct and appeal to similarities. When we move out to these individual and isolated island collectivists of homosexuals, of women, we necessarily lose sight of what it is of our common humanity and the fact that you have relationships with other people. The way this plays out is when a conservative family has a gay child, they are more likely to support gay rights because they have some other connection that is not premised upon the fact that that child is a homosexual. It is the premise that they have given unconditional love and support to that child through that unit and through that family. Necessarily the characteristics of a family, and this is what I've been telling you in my speech, allow you to reach out and support children when they differ. So there's more sympathy. That's the comparative in this debate, right? Are conservative individuals more likely than not to assist different individuals when they are connected to them in a totally socially constructed and arbitrary way or not? We say they are. The second way that families are useful units to change is that they allow you to challenge things. Gay marriage and the co-option of marriage as a conservative unit to change it into something different by the gay rights movement has been one of the most powerful movements and powerful things that the gay rights movement has done. It's presented an image that we are like you. we are normal. And although your institution is changing in a manner, you can see more of the similarities about how we can access this in a similar way to you, as opposed to the differences that exist in us inherently. Their model of go out and seek the world on your own, be an individual, creates islands which no one can relate to and denies the ability for them to achieve change at all. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the member of government. I'll call upon recognize the member of opposition here.
Mr. Speaker, tightly integrated families, first of all, constrict individual autonomy to a harmful extent. Second of all, they end up creating circumstances whereby you perhaps reinforce the patriarchy in the vast majority of situations. But most importantly, what Sean and I would tell you is that we think that they harm the most vulnerable people in society by excluding those who do not have the capacity to enter into the kind of family relationship that they would talk about, but furthermore, the kinds that are already in ones that would like to leave. We think that those are the people we ought care about the most. That's going to be an extension. Before I do that, I want to deal with what you hear from side government more broadly. First of all, I'm going to start with closing government and the newest part of their extension, which came like last. First of all, they say, look, conservatives are more likely to support things like gay rights when they have a family member who perhaps is gay and who they have a general biological support system that makes them care about it when they otherwise wouldn't. A couple of things. Number one, that's assuming that they care about the child more than they care about their capacity to that conservative base. I don't necessarily think that that's true. In fact, for a lot of people, I think that having a gay child as a prominent conservative family is definitely a mark against your family, one that you try and cover up. I don't think that the automatic reaction from those families is to welcome them. Rather, it's to do things like try and fix them. That's why you see a massive amount of people trying to cure homosexuality, because they don't want their family member to go through that. But second of all, this kind of conservative family, I don't think would ever have that child come out in the first place, because it is not the kind of family that makes them feel comfortable doing so, because those kinds of conservative values are ones that they've had to grow up in, and they understand that that kind of family is likely not going to ever support them, or the very risk of them not supporting them might not be worth coming out in the first place, because they're economically and so emotionally tied to one group of people. I think that that harms the gay community. I think that constricting your ability to ever come out in that way is the worst. No. Then what they say is, look, you give support, you give care, you give money or perhaps schooling to individuals only because you're biologically reinforced by them. To some extent, that might be true because people are vain and they'd like to just help their own children. But I don't think that's a good thing. I think that moving away from that kind of norm and perhaps doing things like, I don't know, caring about the people who need these kinds of things the most, not just the people you happen to be born together with, is probably the best kind of circumstance. And destroying that norm, I would say, is the most important way to meaningfully get to that particular place. No. Then what they tell you is, look, you end up actually like ditching people at a young age. They don't understand. They don't have a personal support base. I think that Sean's quite right in saying, look, we'll feed you and do things like that, but we want you to also experience the world and experience other groups of people that you might find meaning in. I think that that kind of family that has a balance both of individuality and perhaps a fallback if that doesn't work out is the best kind of thing. I just don't like the kind that restricts you. That's what we think they mean by actually integrated. Dealing with a couple of points of rebuttal from first half. First of all, what they say is, look, there are inherent built-in relationships that you can't get anywhere else. That's assuming that that family is going to prioritize that unconditional love you say they have. Oftentimes, families end up kicking their kids out if they don't do something that they want, don't want, just that happens. I think that if you buy all the benefits of all that support, when the second that that gets yanked away is so much worse than having to create your own circumstance in the first place, I think that that harm ought be considered. But second of all, what they tell you is, look, what they say is, look, you have to learn to like live with people you don't like. I hate that idea. I think that individuals should often leave if that kind of relationship is unfulfilling for that person individually, whether or not that's because they just don't subscribe to the same kind of viewpoints about what's important, or if it's because they're actively trying to undermine their individual identity to a meaningful extent. I think that that's important. I don't know why you have to ground yourself in those that you were decided to be a part of based on a lottery of birth. I would rather you care about other individuals. Quickly back up.
what incentive does your conservative have to consider gay marriage when they don't have someone around them who is gay and other socially constructed connection to a
Okay,
gay person?
so the best way to get gay rights has often been times lobbies and individuals that are comfortable in their sexuality advocating for their own individual rights. It's not the child who's terrified to talk to his parents in the deep south because they're terrified of the kinds of things that they might lose because of that relationship. I'm going to get into extension now. First of all, I want to talk about why you end up harming vulnerable partners. I think that in a lot of different relationships, the kind of ideals that you are subscribing to, perhaps a family that takes place over a long term that's supposed to stay together forever, oftentimes is unattainable. It's not likely that you are going to be the same person when you marry somebody, probably at some point in your life, or a lot of individuals end up feeling harmed by that relationship or like they want to leave. What ends up happening in that sense? First of all, you're probably integrated economically to some important extent insofar as you have a lot of children. Second of all, you're integrated emotionally insofar as you have created these relationships, oftentimes at the exclusion of maintaining other kinds of relationships that exist outside of that family. So you have a certain amount of time, you're going to be spending that time with your family, not developing other relationships that end up meaning you don't have a fallback when those don't work out. I think that it matters that when you put all your eggs into one basket, it means that you're more likely to compromise on those difficult kinds of decisions to a meaningful extent that would make you feel most harmed. I don't enjoy the idea that vulnerable partners would feel the pressure to stay in relationships that aren't good for them. I think that the family and that integrated aspect ends up meaning that they do. But second of all, I think that the independence ends up being better because it's not predicated on compromising to the happiness of other individuals. I think that the kinds of families that end up doing that necessarily end up being bad for individuals. But second of all, I want to talk about the people who exist outside of this norm, because I think that's true for a lot of people. That's single parents, that's people who end up dealing with divorce. I think that they are actively stigmatized by individuals for failing to achieve that norm that I actually think is unattainable for a lot of individuals. What does that do? It stigmatizes them. It makes people who don't exist in that feel generally unhappy in the kinds of relationships that they are able to achieve themselves. They blame their parents for not staying together. They blame individuals for not being able to achieve that particular kind of norm, which I think is oftentimes unattainable in that sense. But I also think that it means that the kinds of political will for things like childcare for people who don't have that integrated family that can take care of each other disappears, okay? I think that the kinds of things that you want end up ultimately being impacted by what's best for individuals. I don't want to force people to rely on the fact that their family is going to be an actor for good, because I think just a lot of them aren't. Or even if they think that they're being good, oftentimes pigeonhole them into things that they don't want to do. I don't want to rely on that, and I don't want to put people into that kind of pigeonhole, etc. I think that a lot of times this has happened in the United States when Rick Santorum says things like this kind of individual family is extremely important and uses that to justify things like having parents have control over whether or not their daughters can have birth control, okay? That kind of control of the family and that kind of support that they talk about oftentimes ends up leading to individuals feeling particularly harmed by that particular society. And I think that it really harms those people who actually don't have the family that they talk about, which I think is important. So Sean and I tell you a couple of things uniquely. One, we say that the kinds of things that they tell you about, even assuming that there are some kinds of benefits, which we've already stipulated that there aren't, ends up excluding people from actually leaving and ends up excluding those individuals who can't find those based on the lottery of birth. And it's on the basis that we ought care about the most vulnerable in society the most that we beg to oppose.
I'd like to thank the member of opposition for those remarks. I'll recognize the deputy whip. Round out Governor. Here.
Mr. Speaker, if you're a black person, a woman, or a transgender person, the opposition side in this debate wants you to deny your links with your family as much as possible, or to less tightly integrate with that family, and instead lean more towards forming individual, more separate collectives based on your own autonomous choice. The problem with that case was that homophobia and patriarchy existed both within those families and outside of their families. And so long as families were the best unit in order to try to push and force social change by making people who otherwise wouldn't care about you, that was the best way of getting reforms for those social minorities and those oppressed people. In response, closing deals with the easiest case. That is the most conservative, most homophobic parent who doesn't care at all about their own child who comes out. Firstly, we still win a lot of marginal stakeholders who might be slightly homophobic, but more likely to empathize with that child when they know that they are more likely to be connected biologically to them. But even if that was the stakeholder who decided this debate, that conservative homophobic actor, it was the unproven assumption of their case that that conservative would be any less vociferous in their homophobia if they didn't have that gay child. We said, in fact, actually, that gay child would probably be a tempering influence if they were so ashamed of that potentiality coming about, for them to make that opposition to homosexuality so important to their public life. The reason why we take this debate is because we prove on the comparative that in trying to change and reform society where it was homophobic and bigoted outside of families, families were the best mechanism to enforce that change. I'm going to deal with the two fundamental issues that decided this debate. Firstly, was the question of whether familial links produce or deny social consciousness and empathy. Firstly, their case presumes that familial links were to some extent mutually exclusive with social links, external social links, or that they otherwise discourage them. We argue the opposite for three fundamental reasons. Firstly, they assumed that your biological connections to your parents proved or meant that you were less likely or didn't have differences to your parents, which was untrue. The fact that you could be born gay was unrelated to the sexuality of your parents, Mr. Speaker, which meant that, for example, parents who had children who were gay, we said in some cases would be more likely to empathize with them when they knew that they had a biological, moral, and social responsibility to raise those children, when they weren't necessarily the most homophobic people in society, but people who had some likelihood or tendency to change their views. No, thank you. Secondly, we argued in extension and had no response to this point, that biological empathy is actually really good at producing social empathy. Once you've seen someone sacrifice a huge amount of their life for you, it's easier to buy into the project of social empathy, to see that there could be conceivable benefits in a social and collective project rather than one in which you exclusively seek individual benefits or benefits to yourself. Unproven in their case, I'm going to deal with this later, is why exactly as an individual free from familial and empathetic obligations you are likely to buy into a huge collective social movement that was going to enfranchise you. We argue further that it wasn't going to enfranchise you anywhere near than the family was. In extension, they worry about vulnerable partners staying in relationships. But the vulnerable gay people and the vulnerable women in society, under their case, exist as part of vulnerable collectives who are oppressed by the majority, Mr. Speaker, which meant that if they cared about that oppressed group, they needed to have some game plan as to how to change social attitudes overall, rather than relying on democracy where the majority was going to keep those homophobic or sexist views to enforce policy that was in their interests. When you, as a gay person, were in a community of people who were not all entirely gay, you had access to capital and power that existed outside of that you own as an oppressed group. Now to some individual stakeholders. Firstly, on gay people, we think this is actually one of the best stakeholders for our side because, if anything, James brought you the point that it is true that the family is a valued norm and that the progress of gay people has fundamentally emerged out of their capacity to co-opt family narratives. But beyond that, let's talk about women and the fact that the suffragette movement, the feminist movement throughout the first, second, and third waves is built on the language and rhetoric of family. It is fighting with your sisters who exist in a biological sense, the mother, the sister you've seen suffering sexism, but then your capacity to externalize that empathy, recognizing that at the first stage you empathize with the woman you know, but that helps you to empathize with women you don't know because you recognize the relative similarity of them. And to finish out this point, no thank you, on the capacity for empathy under familial situations, let's make the fundamental point that your capacity to empathize with those people as humans is undermined when, under the comparative, you're encouraged into groups where you see yourself as oppositionally related to everyone else in society, to only make friends or families in the false constructed sense of their case with other gay people instead of trying to form links beyond those conceptions. What's the second question why? It is why the only reasonable way they can win this debate, which is to provide a feasible alternative, failed on every single measure of it. I'll take closing.
Okay, so you might have some families who end up accepting these kinds of people, that's fine. There are a lot who won't, and you're using children at the most vulnerable stage as a battering ram for social movements rather than allowing them to exist within groups that actually will support them.
But those children who are gay, for example, are still discriminated against in the society that you create. Just because they have marginally more gay friends doesn't mean that the straight majority doesn't have the power to use the law and society to enforce values and norms on those gay people that are bad. The way this debate changes is in looking at the stakeholder who is going to change the way that they treat their children. That is the not all entirely extremely homophobic parents, but the ones who exist more at the moderate margins of the debate, understanding how their behavior might change. And that relates quite directly to this theme that I'm talking about right now. Firstly, the assumption under their case, no thank you, that you can just choose your collective identity under the paradigm that they create or move towards. We say that any transgender community that represents itself as only in the interests and only acting in the interests of transgender people is never going to be able to persuade people that reforms in their interests are good or things that other people should support. But when you're a transgender child whose parent is more likely to become empathetic to you because they see themselves as related morally, socially, and biological to you, they're more likely to accept that that is a mission they can buy into as well, rather than seeing that as exclusively a minority mission, because otherwise there's no reason for them to buy into that project. They say individuals are more empathetic. We say the opposite. We'd say, firstly, the empirical trend away from family life is heavily correlated with the rise of individualism. What causes that? It's the exclusive conception of selfhood that says that you don't need to care about other people unless they have the same interests as you, Mr. Speaker, which is what their collective socialism model functionally operates with. It says that you should only care about other interests and campaign for other interests or lobby for them so long as you and other gay people or you and other trans people benefit from them. We make people who aren't members of those groups fight for that change. We change the treatment of these people, not just in families, but in society in broad. We're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the government whip and call upon recommends the opposition whip to round out this first round. Here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to go through this round in terms of a few broad ideas. But first, and I think it's unfortunate that I have to do this, I'm actually going to look at what the two comparative worlds are in this round, what both sides are advocating for. Because I think what we got, especially from second proposition, was a complete mischaracterization of what we stand for. Obviously, on opposition benches, we don't stand for the complete severing of links with one's family. And in the same way that it would be a horrible misrepresentation if we said that the tightly knit family model means you have absolutely no friends outside the family, it's a complete misrepresentation for them to say that what we stand for is for you to have no connection with your family. What we stand for is obviously, because this is a This House Regrets motion, the status quo of what happens, where a lot of families have children who, for instance, they see from time to time upon adulthood, but don't. But the family is not the dominant measure of analysis in their life. That the collective family decisions aren't always made. That there isn't an expectation that children will live geographically near their families. That's what this round is about. Second prop seems to think that we propose the abolition of the family. We propose a more restricted conception of the family, that which exists now, that which still protects the basic interests of people in that family and will still come through to you if, for instance, you have lost your job and you need somewhere to stay. It will still come through for you if you need a helping hand, but there aren't the dominant influence in your life upon reaching adulthood. That's what this round is actually about. No, and I'll give more POIs to people who offer them non-verbally. The first thing I'd like to talk about is how you achieve social change on the two sides of the house. Because I'm going to talk firstly in broad terms and then on the specific example of gay marriage that's become a big issue in this round. On broad terms, I think the biggest problem with second proposition saying that the family should always be the mechanism by which social change is achieved, rather than things such as common interests as like a group within society that all want to pursue something, or just common values such as like a notion that people, regardless of the way in which they were born, all deserve the same dignity. The major problem with the way in which second proposition is conceived of this is that it assumes that the family will have a common interest in affecting that social change, but there are examples where that's not the case. There are some changes that will benefit certain members of all families at the expense of other members of families in general. And the big example is the women's liberation movement that Aislin talked about. What response do we get from second proposition? They say laughably that third wave feminism has focused on the family as an important part of your identity as a woman. I would say to the contrary, that third wave feminism has said that regardless of whether you are a member of a family or not, that you have value as an individual as a woman. I think that is extremely important, that being a part of a family is not a precondition for rights. Go ahead.
Talk about the incentives, particularly misogynistic males have, if they don't have a woman or a gay person in their life to affect change.
Okay, so again, this notion that families are in situations not enough to win proposition benches the case. They need to prove specifically that tightly integrated families are necessary for that. I think any benefit that simply accrues from having a family in general is one that we can be comfortable with still accepting on our side of the house. They need to specifically prove why the loss of tightly integrated families is specifically detrimental to this, which I think flies in the face of empirical reality. Let's move to the gay marriage issue. They said, look, gay families can show that we're families like you. As I just said, we didn't get one word of why those families specifically have to be tightly integrated in order to achieve those effects. In fact, we would say that a lot of these gay families are from the liberal communities in which families tend not to be as tightly integrated. But moreover, Aislin already showed you that that acceptance isn't necessarily going to be automatic, and that a lot of people are going to be sacrificed as a result, that they have to suffer through living in families that don't accept them on the proposition side of the house as a mechanism for that social change to happen. That instrumentalizing view of what that human life is going to be, which you have to suffer at the hands of a family that won't accept you so that they can learn their lesson over time, we think is a disgusting model of how social change should occur. Not right now. Let's turn to individual rights. Aislin told you, and rightly so, that the family just in the most general terms restricts your ability to choose what is best for you. We'd say that that situation in which your decisions are necessarily tied to everyone else's means that you will have less beneficial distribution of what happens, of goods to different people. No. From first proposition, we get this notion of, well, look, families can protect you if you don't fit in, but that assumes that the family itself is going to protect you. What we've already told you is that a non-dependence of the family not being the dominant part of your life, makes it easier for you to escape situations in which your family is not good for you. For instance, if you are a transgender person whose family simply is never going to accept you, you have the option of moving to a community in which you are more likely to be accepted. Second proposition says, well, look, they could be the same harms out there in the world. We'd say that that you have an ability to select for a community in which the chances of those harms accruing are less likely. We think that if you are moving from Mississippi to San Francisco, the chances of you being assaulted on the street for being gay dramatically lower. But moreover, Aislin told you, and we got no response to this, for other people who are coerced and hurt by being stuck in a family, specifically people who are miserable in there or who are vulnerable to abuse. Proposition had to deal with the cases in which people have a lessened ability to leave the family because the family is the dominant part of what their life is. What we give you on our side of the house is that people who are desperately miserable in a family have a better ability to exit in our world. Go.
If tightly integrated families were normalized, aren't families a lot less likely to kick out children who are gay and more likely to accept both them and gay marriage as a whole, reducing the level of stigma of gay marriage in society broadly?
We'd say that being stuck in if your family hates you, being stuck in a family and not kicked out of it, if your family hates you for being gay, is not much better than being kicked out of the family and having an opportunity to move to a better community. Finally, I'd like to close on what happens to those who are outside of the family. Because regardless of how broad the norm of what the family is, there will always be some people who fall outside of it. And what Aislin told you, and we got no response to that, is people who do fall outside of it, such as single parents, where a dominant norm of what the family looks like does not include single parents, that there is less political will to provide for them because they're seen as an aberration. When second proposition tells you that there are unique benefits to societies and to families in terms of protecting the rights of people within it, we have two responses that absolutely win us the debate. The first is that we still have societies on our side to protect those basic interests. We're happy if the families do less for you, if they still take care of your basic needs and you can get your other needs taken care of elsewhere. But more importantly, to the extent that there are unique benefits to being in a family that you can't get anywhere else, those unique benefits are denied to people who do not fit within the norm of those families. Thus, we want to lessen the degree to which any benefit you receive in society depends on you being part of a norm that some people will be excluded from. For that reason, we proudly oppose.